this is really focused on how you're going to be designing your MRPs in terms of, like we mentioned before, how do you explain research to the people that you're speaking to? Okay, so that's what the focus is on here, and I'm going to take you through a few studies I've done, just showing you examples of how I've explained research to participants. So goodness of fit ethics is something I've been working on for the last 20 years. I developed it starting with informed consent. But I want to start off with why we are here, right? Why are we in this institute? And, you know, as we know, the global HIV, AIDS, and drug abuse pandemic requires a need for empirically informed interventions, but the characteristics of the populations that we study provides us with these ethical challenges, and the moral reflections of investigators and IRBs are just insufficient because we don't really know how our participants are thinking. So what's needed is this empirical basis for research ethics policies and practices that reflect participants' values as well as their lived experiences. So goodness of fit ethics talks about the fact that vulnerability in life does not equal research vulnerability. Just because somebody uses drugs or somebody is HIV or somebody is a sex worker or is poor does not by definition mean that they're vulnerable in research. Whereas research vulnerability is the failure of investigators to fit research procedures to participant research assets, what are their strengths, and susceptibility to research harms. And so the point of goodness of fit ethics is to shift the burden of the definition of research vulnerability from the participant to the research context, and whether or not. So some things we do can make a participant vulnerable to what we're doing, and some things we can do can make them non-vulnerable. So the kinds of questions that we need to ask from a goodness of fit ethics perspective is, first of all, there's no cookie cutter solutions to fitting research ethics practices and policies to all populations and all research designs, as we will know. So we have to ask these questions. What are the special life circumstances that may render participants more or less vulnerable to research harms, right? That's why we're doing our studies. Which aspects of the research design may create or exacerbate existing research vulnerabilities? And how can procedures be modified to best fit participants' abilities, values, and their lived experiences? So if you keep those questions in mind as you're developing your questions, then this can lead to knowledge that can help other investigators. So one way to minimize research vulnerability is through co-learning. And co-learning sees the investigator and participant as equals, but having different expertise. So you don't have to be the same to be equal. So our expertise as investigators is we know what the knowledge base is. We know the scientific method. We know how to test a hypothesis. We also know the ethical procedures that are available to us and that are required through federal or international regulations. But participants are experts in their own health priorities, in the cultural values that they bring, to the fears and hopes they face in terms of what we're doing, and the scientific enterprise in particular, and the real-world context in which hypotheses will be studied. So the methodology of co-learning is to ensure that participants are familiar with the research methods and context for which their opinions are sought. Questions should explicitly communicate or clearly address the ethical issue. As I was explaining to you, I would talk about, we're confused as researchers about whether giving money to people who use drugs is a good thing or a bad thing. And avoid procedures that discourage non-contemplative responses. In other words, we don't want to ask them, what do you think? Is that good or is that bad? No, we want to get their opinion. And that doesn't mean we don't do quantitative data, but our quantitative data has to be have the nuance to be able to get at their opinions. Okay, so the first study I'm going to talk about, give you an example of how we explained research to people, is called Do Researchers Have a Duty to Warn Third Parties at Risk for HIV Transmission? This was a NIDA sponsored study that we conducted. And we did focus groups. So our key goodness of fit ethics questions were, and this is like your aims, right, and your purpose. When, if ever, does an ethnographer have a moral obligation to break participant confidentiality to warn third parties that they are at risk for HIV? So that's our question. How is ethical justification for confidentiality and disclosure decisions related to informed consent? So we ran 11 focus groups. There were 100 economically, educationally, and marginalized people who used drugs. They were ethnically diverse. Around a third of them were HIV positive. This was the study I did with Housing Works, by the way. We had a video script that we drew up to try to explain these different ethical dilemmas that researchers face, and then these were modified by our community advisory board, which was made up of people who work at Housing Works, but also people who use drugs and were had past experience being homeless, so that your CAVs, as Peg and Seattle talk about, really should also include people who are prospective participants or represent the participant community, not just leaders, because that could be a different perspective. We did videos in both English and Spanish. We did a male version and a female version. We eliminated heterosexist bias with gender-neutral names. So you'll see that the participant in this vignette is a male, but we named the partner Chris, so it could be a female or a male partner. And we started with a narrator who encourages the focus group members to think about the ethical issues. So, we're not trying to surprise somebody. This is not deception. We really want to get their opinions.
The research shown in this video is called field research or ethnographic research. In this kind of study, the researcher, whose name is Maria, hangs out with and gets to know the members of the community she is trying to understand. In the scene you're about to watch, Maria has been spending several months with people in the neighborhood who use heroin and who have or are at risk of getting HIV. She is both talking with drug users about their sexual practices and observing their drug use to understand the conditions that lead them to share needles and drug injection equipment. In these types of studies, the researcher usually gets to know one or two drug users very well, and these drug users introduce the researcher to other drug users in the community. In this video, Maria is meeting with a drug user named Steve. Steve agreed to be in the study 2 months ago. Since then, he has introduced Maria to a lot of people he uses drugs with for the study. As you watch the video, think about what problems the current situation is making for both Steve and Maria, how they are both feeling, and what should be done.
Hey, Maria. What'd you bring me today?
The usual, the sandwich and a coffee.
Oh, great. I'm starved.
Steve, I'm so glad you've introduced me to so many people in the neighborhood. It's really helped me to find people to interview for my research.
Yeah? Well, Chris told me about the interview you did yesterday. And how are you going to do another one tomorrow? I've been going out with Chris for about a month now. What did Chris tell you about me?
You know I can't tell you the things that people tell me, unless they're planning to hurt you. I can't even tell Chris the things you've told me.
Good. Because I wouldn't want Chris to know I'm HIV positive.
You mean Chris doesn't know?
No. Chris is negative and we don't use protection.
I wish you hadn't told me this. Now I have a problem. Remember I told you that if I found out that you might be able to hurt someone, I'd have to tell them?
No, I don't remember that.
Well, when we first met 2 months ago, you signed a consent form that said that I might have to let someone know if I knew you were planning to hurt them. I thought you understood.
Yeah, well, I was probably high, and I needed the money you were talking about. Anyway, I wouldn't hurt Chris.
Yeah, but you could still infect Chris with HIV. Doesn't Chris have a right to know that?
Anyway, I know people who have sex with people who are positive who never get HIV.
You're still taking a big risk. You should say something to Chris, or I could tell...
No way. I gave you permission to write down stuff I talk about, not to ruin my sex life. If you told Chris, it'd be over, and I couldn't handle that. Can we just finish up the questions you have, talk about Chris later? What other questions you have, Marie, for me?
Okay, let's get the usual questions out the way. When was the last time you got high?
Well, actually, it's been hours, and I'm really kind of freaking out. I might not even be able to finish this interview. I really need a fix now, and I don't have any money. Hey, I got an idea. You know how you usually pay me after we meet? Well, why don't you give me some of the money in advance, and I can go get a fix now? Yeah, you give me half the money right now, and I can go get my stuff, and I can come back and finish answering your questions, and then get the rest of the money. As long as I get some of the money right now. Come on. We're friends, right?
I don't know.
Okay, so let's hope this works. No? Okay, hold on. Okay.
The research shown in this video is called field research or ethnographic research. In this kind of study, the researcher, whose name is Maria, hangs out with and gets to know the members of the community she is trying to understand. In the scene you're about to watch, Maria has been spending several months with people in the neighborhood who use heroin and who have or are at risk of getting HIV. She is both talking with drug users about their sexual practices and observing their drug use to understand the conditions that lead them to share needles and drug injection equipment. In these types of studies, the researcher usually gets to know 1 or 2 drug users very well, and these drug users introduce the researcher to other drug users in the community. In this video, Maria is meeting with a drug user named Steve. Steve agreed to be in the study 2 months ago. Since then, he has introduced Maria to a lot of people he uses drugs with for the study. As you watch the video, think about what problems the current situation is making for both Steve and Maria, how they are both feeling, and what should be done.
Hey, Marie. What'd you bring me today?
The usual, sandwich and a coffee.
Oh, great. I'm starved.
Steve, I'm so glad you've introduced me to so many people in the neighborhood. It's really helped me to find people to interview for my research.
Yeah. Well, Chris told me about the interview you did yesterday. And how are you going to do another one tomorrow? You know, I've been going out with Chris for about a month now. What did Chris tell you about me?
You know I can't tell you the things that people tell me, unless they're planning to hurt you. I can't even tell Chris the things you've told me.
Because I wouldn't want Chris to know I'm HIV positive.
You mean Chris doesn't know?
No. Chris is negative, and we don't use protection.
I wish you hadn't told me this. Now I have a problem. Remember I told you that if I found out that you might be able to hurt someone, I'd have to tell them?
No, I don't remember that.
Well, when we first met 2 months ago, you signed a consent form that said that I might have to let someone know if I knew you were planning to hurt them. I thought you understood.
Yeah, well, I was probably high, and I needed the money you're talking about. Anyway, I wouldn't hurt Chris.
Yeah, but you could still infect Chris with HIV. Doesn't Chris have a right to know?
I know people who have sex with people who are positive who never get HIV.
You're still taking a big risk. You should say something to Chris, or I could tell.
No, wait. I gave you permission to write down stuff I talk about, not to ruin my sex life. If you told Chris, it'd be over, and he couldn't handle that. Can we just finish up the questions you have, talk about Chris later? What other questions you have for me?
Okay, let's get the usual questions out the way.
All right, so then it goes on to something else. Okay, so number one, they loved this. They were yelling back at the at the screen. We had a whole bunch of these vignettes, and they were, don't tell them, don't do that, you know. So they really kind of enjoyed this. They took it very personally. So here were some of the things that, remember I was talking about some of the so on the left is kind of, after we did a content analysis, what we thought was some of the themes. So some of them thought of the researcher as a moral agent, and remember this was quite a while ago, so there wasn't PrEP, there wasn't, you know, and HIV was still something that there was no medication for that people could afford. So they felt that there was an obligation to say something. They would talk about how the investigator's personal conscience would bother them if they didn't tell Chris. So that was one. Now, one of the things is, you should not expect that your participants are going to have a homogeneity in terms of perspectives, just like we're going around the room here, we don't. So, you know, it's important to get at what the range of perspectives are on these issues. Others talked about the researcher's obligation to the community, that if, I forgot his name already, but the other guy, whoever he was, you know, Steve, thank you. You know, Steve was harming people. He had no right to do that. So so you had an obligation to the community to warn Chris. Other people felt that Steve had a responsibility to tell Chris that the participant is a moral agent, and so Steve had given up his right to confidentiality because he was violating a moral norm. But others felt that Chris had the responsibility, you know, because they said, look, everybody knows about HIV. It's Chris's responsibility to ask Steve or to use a condom or whatever it is. So I thought that was very interesting, because nobody, you know, in ethics before this, everybody always talked about, you know, people who are considered vulnerable as vulnerable in everything and not having moral agency themselves. And here I think there was a lot of moral agency that was, you know, communicated. Others felt that informed consent, they had very different feelings, but informed consent was very important. Number one, if he was high, then, you know, that wasn't right, that she had collected that. Others said it was, you know, if IC was promised, it was illegal. You know, because a lot of people look at informed consent as a contract. They don't understand, even though we say you have the right to withdraw, so that was very important. And others really talked about pragmatism. You know, if you turn around and tell maybe, you know, Steve is going to kill her, or don't reveal this but encourage Chris to get tested. So, by the way I put this together was that she interviewed both, that she had a relationship to both. Because if you're familiar with Tarasov, you can't inform if you don't know who that person is. So that's why I think it was a more sensitive dilemma, because as an anthropologist, she actually had a relationship with Chris as well as with Steve. Anyhow. Okay, so then the issue really is, so we get this in our research, what is the impact, right? Because when you write a grant, or, you know, you want to say, what is the impact? So here, some of the recommendations we made was, prior to the study, draw on community expertise to determine the limits of confidentiality that are acceptable in that community based on potential harms, their resources, and their values. Clearly specify and ensure participants understand the extent and limits of disclosure. during IC. Revisit confidentiality disclosure obligations during multiple meetings. This is especially important, as many of you know who do continued interviews, as you were talking about, Derek. And assuming a protective stance over participants without considering their own definitions of autonomy and responsibility may lead to poorly fitted confidentiality procedures. So we may have been overprotective if we decided to disclose. Okay, so the next format I want to talk about is this other study we did assessing and enhancing the HIV vaccine trial consent preparedness among street drug users. WPUD or whatever it is wasn't out at that time, so I'm sorry I used this terminology, but that's what it was at that time. Okay, so what are the questions? What are informational barriers to HIV vaccine trial consent among marginalized persons who use street drugs? Well, we know that, do they have the knowledge? They need the knowledge about what is HIV transmission, what are vaccines, what is research. We can't ask them these, in order to have informed consent, they have to know this. And we also have to deal with research and medical distrust. So the aim of the study was, can a brief lesson fitted to this population's needs correct misconceptions and increase HIV vaccine trial relevant knowledge? Okay, and can a brief lesson reduce research mistrust? So the procedures were, we piloted to determine what some of the participant misconceptions and informational needs were. We did street recruitment. So we did a pre-test, a lesson, and a post-test conducted in community storefronts and read to participants. There were 30 HIV negative impoverished active drug users. 44% had less than a high school degree. So this was PowerPoint, but it was on a, like an iPad, and we would sit next to the person and go over this. And I got, most of this was CDC had something like that. Not exactly like this, because they weren't explaining vaccine studies, but they were explaining what they thought the vaccine was going to be. So I took a lot of that knowledge base. But here you can see, I explain what researchers are doing. Researchers are testing whether or not new medications can prevent HIV. These research studies are called experimental HIV vaccine studies or HIV clinical trials. For each study, researchers do not know if the vaccine works until the study is over. Okay, so trying to avoid the therapeutic misconception or a conception that everybody's going to get the vaccine. If you don't get the vaccine, it doesn't work. I mean, you're being deprived. So a vaccine is a drug that prevents people from getting a disease like hepatitis or polio. There is no vaccine for HIV because a lot of people in the community believed there was a vaccine. They also believed, as some of you know, it's probably still around, but not as much, that scientists gave the population HIV. So we were trying to address, the mistrust, okay? Researchers test whether or not the new vaccine works by comparing its effects to a placebo, right? So we explained what the two sides were going to be, a fake drug versus a real drug. We explained randomization, that everyone who volunteers has an equal chance. This is called randomization. It's like a coin toss. So explaining all those things that we take for granted, and neither the volunteer or the researchers know who is getting, right? So we're trying to explain the blind to them. We talked about the side effects, which were not extreme. Who can participate? We want to explain that you had to be HIV negative. So, of course, you had to have an HIV test before you're in the study. What to expect if they participate, how long it would be, how long it lasts, what you are going to be paid. How will the researcher know if it works? That you're going to be getting blood tests, you're going to be looking at the buildup of antibodies, and then at the end of the study, you're going to see whether or not people who got the vaccine were less susceptible to HIV. This was very important, that the vaccine does not contain the HIV virus, because what we found was actually we had also asked a question in pretest about whether they understood what a vaccine was. The people who were more knowledgeable about vaccines, because most vaccines are injecting you with the disease, they thought they were going to be injected with HIV. So it was very important to explain to them that that wasn't the case. and that you can't get the HIV from the vaccine. You can't transmit it to others if you get the vaccine. We talked about the false positive tests, and I don't want to take too long, about voluntary and confidential. You can have all these slides, so if you want to do something yourself like this, you can use my video. So, what did we find? We found that the lesson, these are just some of the questions, but that it significantly decreased the research and vaccine misconceptions that were in the pretest. And you can see it was pretty big in terms of misconception and going down in terms of having a correct answer. Just the fact that vaccine contains HIV virus, that the vaccine will increase your probability of transmitting HIV, but we did not find that it reduced mistrust. So all of the, some of what we would call myths, that scientists will not be honest, the government, doesn't test safety, vaccine studies sponsored. So, that really told us something, that simply providing a knowledge base is really not going to undermine, to get rid of years of, and actually generations of not trusting.
I like the last point.
Yeah, science issues.
Zero change.
Right, yep, yep. Okay. So when we published this, what was the lessons learned? What are the implications for the responsible conduct of research? Without educational lessons, this population may be unprepared for informed consent for vaccines. Pre-study lessons were fitted to participant informational needs, so that whole PowerPoint was based on what we found participants didn't understand. Enhanced understanding is not the same as believing in the honesty and good intention of investigators. Research distrust is linked to participant and group histories of health disparities, research exploitation, as you know, but it also leads to low participation rates, and so that we have populations that remain untested and we don't know whether it works with them. I think we at that time we didn't know if there was a drug-drug interaction with anything that was going on for HIV. Investigators need to work with community groups to develop relationships and procedures that engender trust. Of course, you all know this now. I did want to point out that the participants actually thanked our researchers. They said nobody ever explained HIV to them, no less this HIV and what research was about. And I felt that was nice, that we were giving something away. Okay, so this last one is some work we did with ethnic minority, sexual health, LGBT youth. So this was addressing the issue of waiver of informed consent for adolescents, and whether or not we should waive it and whether or not they understood informed consent for a PrEP study. The CDC recommends pre-exposure prophylactics for high-risk populations. Sexual and gender minority youth comprise the majority of new HIV diagnoses. So here's all the thing. There's no current evidence-based PrEP prevention programs. IRBs refuse to waive guardian permission for HIV prevention studies, which leads to low recruitment and leads to the fact that there was at the time, and still really is, no empirical basis for good interventions with LGBT youth. Because even in the adolescent trials, they got so few because most of the sites were required to get guardian permission, which was crazy. Okay, so then I talk about federal regulations. So this was published. I've also presented a primer. But here was what important was the fact that for legal minors, and you'll hear more, so I'm not going to go into it as much, but for legal minors, Subpart D does provide waivers for guardian permission if the study is minimal risk, or if in fact guardian permission is not adequate protection. So we cite the federal regulations. And so you can waive it as long as there's an appropriate substitute mechanism. So what are the goodness of fit questions? Is guardian permission a reasonable protection for sexual and gender minority youth who participate in PrEP research? Is adolescent self-consent an adequate protection? That is, do they have the competencies to consent themselves? So what we did was we presented them. We had 74 sexually active 14 to 17-year-olds They viewed and animated descriptions of a PrEP HIV prevention study and responded to an online survey. It was anonymous, but it was also, we did asynchronous focus group discussions, which were fantastic. I don't know if any of you have ever done that, but what you do is in the morning, you present a couple of questions and then they type in answers during the day, and then they can respond to one another. It's like a chat room kind of, and then then you always have a monitor, and then in the afternoon you present more of your questions. So it was the way of doing a focus group anonymously with sexual and gender minority youth.
Hi, my name is Celia. Today I'm going to tell you about a new medication for HIV prevention called PrEP. I'm also going to describe a research study designed to test different ways to ensure teenagers are getting the greatest benefit from taking PrEP. Today in the focus groups, you'll answer some questions based on this PrEP study, so watch and learn. PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. PrEP is a medication that comes in a pill. PrEP protects you from getting HIV by blocking the HIV virus from getting to the immune cells of your body that help you stay healthy. Try thinking of PrEP as armor for your body's immune cells. To keep that armor strong, you have to take the pills every single day around the same time. Otherwise, the armor becomes weak and HIV can get through, hurt your immune system, and spread. Think about it like this. Armor doesn't work unless you use it consistently. PrEP only works for people who do not have HIV, people who are HIV negative. Research studies on adults have found that PrEP is really effective when taken daily, but it's not 100% effective against HIV. In addition, research has shown that sticking to PrEP every day can be hard for adults, and even more difficult for teenagers. One study showed that only 6 out of every 10 teens were able to stick to taking PrEP every day. So that all sounds great, but what are the risks? In studies with adults, the side effects of PrEP have been mild and include nausea and diarrhea. The good news is that these side effects go away after your body gets used to the medication. A rare but serious side effect is that PrEP might weaken your bones. For that reason, teens taking PrEP are required to visit their doctor every few months to make sure they stay healthy. Because PrEP isn't 100% effective, and because it's normal to forget to take your medication every once in a while, it's important to continue to use other safer sex practices like condoms if you're taking PrEP. And remember, you must take PrEP every day, even on days when you don't have sex. Another reason to use safer sex practices is that PrEP does not protect you from other sexually transmitted infections. So, why study PrEP in LGBTQ teens if we already know some things about PrEP from studies with adults? First off, all sexually active teens are at risk for HIV, especially if they do not use other forms of protection or have multiple sex partners. Second, as we mentioned, teens have a harder time sticking to medication than adults do. Third, other issues related to being an LGBTQ teen might make it even harder for LGBTQ teens to stick to PrEP every day. For example, if you aren't out to your parents or guardians, it might be harder to take PrEP every day. You might worry about keeping the medication in a safe place where no one can find it, or not want your parents to know you're having sex. For these reasons, it's important to do PrEP studies with LGBTQ teens so researchers and healthcare providers know the best ways to help sexually active LGBTQ youth take PrEP the right way for HIV prevention. Next, we're going to give you an example of what a study aimed at seeing how well LGBTQ teens stick to taking PrEP every day could look like. Later on in the focus groups, we'll ask you to imagine that you're being asked to participate in this study and what you think about it. The purpose of this study would be to see whether getting daily text message reminders would help LGBTQ youth who are at risk for HIV remember to take PrEP every day. You can only join the study if you are having sex frequently, did not regularly use protection, and did not have HIV. If your test said that you did not have HIV, a doctor would give you 3 months' worth of the PrEP pills to take home with you, and a counselor would talk to you about safer sex practices. The study would last a year, and every 3 months you would come back for an HIV test, other health tests, counseling, and receive another 3 months' worth of pills. To test whether text messaging actually helps LGBTQ teens remember to take PrEP daily, researchers would compare the pill taking and sexual health of teens who do not get the text messaging, Group A, to teens who do get the daily text messaging, Group B. You would be randomly assigned to one of these two groups. So being assigned to one of these groups is kind of like a coin toss. Everybody has the same 50-50 chance of being in each group. To make sure the study is fair, the teens and researchers don't choose who gets to be in which group. Group A. At the beginning of the study, teens in this group would only get the info on how to practice safer sex and the importance of taking PrEP every day, and during regular check-ins with a study counselor every 3 months for a year. Group B. People in this group would get the same information as the folks in Group A, plus daily text messages that would remind them to take PrEP. During your 3-month check-ins, you would talk to the counselor again about safe sex and sticking to PrEP every day. You'd also answer some questions about how many days you didn't take PrEP. You would get another HIV test, and if you ever tested positive during the study, you would have to stop the study and the researchers would help you to find a medical clinic for HIV treatment. Once the study is over, researchers will know whether or not getting daily text messages increased LGBTQ teens' ability to take the PrEP pills daily. This will help doctors in the future decide whether to offer text messaging as part of HIV prevention treatment. Here's the gist, in case you missed anything. If you were sexually active and did not have HIV, you would be asked to participate in the PrEP study for a year. If you had HIV, the researchers would help you to find doctors to provide HIV treatment. At the beginning of the study, and every 3 months, you'd be tested for HIV. A study counselor would speak to you about the importance of taking the PrEP pill every day and would teach you about safer sex practices. And a doctor would give you PrEP pills to take daily for 3 months as part of the study. If you were assigned to Group A, this would be all you'd do. If you were assigned to Group B, you would also get daily text messages reminding you to take your PrEP pill. Got it? Good. Now let's get back to the focus groups and talk about what you just learned. Remember to keep the study in mind while answering the questions.
So I'm just going to play a few minutes of this PrEP video because I think it was too long, but the kids did watch it. We had to explain HIV transmission first because, of course, they wouldn't know that. So, and then...
My name is Celia. Today I'm going to tell you about a new medication for HIV prevention called PrEP. I'm also going to describe a research study designed to test different ways to ensure teenagers are getting the greatest benefit from taking PrEP. Today in the focus groups, you'll answer some questions based on this PrEP study, so watch and learn. PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. PrEP is a medication that comes in a pill. PrEP protects you from getting HIV by blocking the HIV virus from getting to the immune cells of your body.
I'll go back. Anyhow, we had a lot of that. I'm not going to go into it, but we had a lot of that. We explained randomization. You know, we did the same thing kind of like on the PowerPoint, but this was a Prezi, right? Okay, so what did we learn? So one of the questions we asked, would you participate in a PrEP study if guardian permission is required? So 61% of the youth who were not out and 21% who were out to parents would refuse to participate. And I think that's very important because there's, you know, this notion that, of course, if you're out, your parents are supportive. But the kids were saying, you know, either this would out me to my parents or my parents would punish me, or they know, but they, you know, they don't approve. So you can't just simply assume that disclosure is important. Can they make a reasoned participation decision? And so we found that they understood the study requirements, that they understood random assignment, they would talk about that. They understood the risks, that they were not being protected against STIs if they used PrEPs, and that's why you had to use condoms. They understood the benefits. And then there's something called appreciation. I don't know if I know you're doing something on informed consent, Roman, but understanding is whether or not you understand the information that's presented to you. Appreciation is whether you understand how it is related to your life in terms of participating in the study. So here you can see they talked about I'd be out. So some said I wouldn't be in the study because I was taking the pills, I'd be outed. So that's an appreciation. That's a good reason not to participate in the study. Or some people said I'm too forgetful. Or some people say, well, I take birth control pills, so, you know, that's fine with me. Or others said I have I already have health risks, so I don't want bones. But these were all appreciation and reasoned decisions about their participation. So anyhow, after all of this, what were the implications? What's the impact of this study when we published it? IRB should first consider whether adolescents recruited for HIV prevention research are actually children under Subpart D, because I don't want to go into it. They'll go into it because basically the federal regulations say you're not a child if in fact you have access to these medical procedures in your state. So if you're a mature minor, you're not a child. If children, there's sufficient empirical data suggesting that for a significant percentage of these children, guardian permission is not a reasonable protection because they would be harmed. Sexual and gender minority youth can make a reasoned consent decision when investigators take an age-appropriate educative approach. As IRB, so this was specifically, when we published this, we published it in a journal that a lot of IRB people read. As IRBs seek to protect the rights and welfare of sexual and gender minority youth, we need to reconceptualize access to HIV prevention trials as a critical health care right that requires protections against research exclusion. So these are the kinds of things you might be concluding in your research. So why are we here today? So this kind of goodness of fit ethics is integral to good research design, as Elizabeth was talking about. It enhances participant participation, trust, and response validity. There are no cookie-cutter solutions to fitting research ethics practices and policies to all populations in research design, so that's why we're doing this study. It shows feasibility for other studies you want to do. It shows how we increase the validity of our studies. Participant investigators and IRBs may have very different perspectives on the value, validity, risks, and potential benefits of research that we need to understand. And empirical studies like the type you're going to be doing are an essential means of ensuring that responsible conduct of research is informed by these different perspectives.